All right. Well, hey, my name's Tony. It's good to be with you guys. Make some noise if you were at summer camp last week. You got okay. Okay. Hey, it's great to be back. Summer camp was a blast. For those of you who didn't go, we love you. We were so glad that you're with us this week. And for those of you who did go, like, it was awesome. It was just a week full of worship, full of games, full of just a lot of really fun stuff. And for a lot of you that are just have looked at this stage even once, like since I've been up here, you probably see this little white like Band-Aid looking thing on my nose. That was from camp. It's fine. Basically what happened, I broke my nose at camp. And so, yeah, so that's why if I sound a little nasally today, like I got a bunch of like casts, I don't know. The doctor just did something to try to fix it. So that's what's going on. But kind of the story behind that is we were at camp and I was playing in the basketball tournament. And so I'm playing with a few guys and go up for a rebound and just get a forearm to the nose. And it's one of those like my nose is supposed to be straight and it like started bleeding and whatever. And so I got it all cleaned up and then walked back to my room and got it all kind of washed off and looked in the mirror. And at first I thought my head was looking in the mirror sideways. And then I was like, oh no, that's just my nose that's kind of twisted like where it's not supposed to be. And so I was looking at that. I was like, well, okay, that's not good. And so I kind of popped it back as best I could and then went off to dinner as one does. I was like, okay, cool, we're good to go. And so I show up to dinner and Danny Howard and Courtney Lopez are looking at me. They're like, what'd you do to your nose? Because I had like blood all down my shirt and my shorts. I'm like, I'm fine, guys. Like, this is just another day at camp. They're like, no, there's something wrong with you. I was like, okay, yeah. So like my nose got hit pretty hard. I think it's broken, but it's going to be okay. And they look at me. They're just like, you're a moron. You have to go to the doctor. Like that's not how this works. You're not just going to be okay. You have to do something about it if you have a broken bone. And so long story short, I wind up listening to their advice. I go to the doctor. The doctor, of course, tells me, he's like, yeah, you got a broken nose. You could do one of two things. He's like, the first is you can have surgery. You can go get it like fixed and so that you can actually breathe out of your nose again. Because I couldn't breathe out of the left side. I was like, who needs that anyways? But he's like, okay, you can get it fixed and then you'll be able to breathe again. Or you can leave it the way it is and just deal with it. But it's not going to get better on its own. And so I'm sitting there and I'm like, so surgery or I can't breathe. What's the third option? Like, what else can I do? And so I could sit there and as I was debating between those two options, I was thinking about it. I was like, okay, there is a third option, but I think we could all just kind of agree that it would be a crazy one. It would be, okay, so, I could get surgery. I could keep it the way it is. Or, I could just like start praying really hard and I could get down on my knees. I'd be like, God, fix my nose. God, fix my nose. Like, please, maybe if I just pray hard enough, like you'll bring this miracle about, like, I know you can heal. And so just fix my nose. And, I think that like I could have done that, but probably what happened is I would have realized like, okay, God has put doctors on this earth who know what they're doing and who can do stuff like this so that they can fix my nose. That, I was praying for a miracle, but really what God wanted to do was like he provided all the means for me to get there so that he didn't have to. But I think what we do in our life, I promised I'd sit down because I'm not supposed to move around a lot, but that's just not going to happen. So, but what we do in our lives is the same thing. It's not just with my nose where I was like, okay, God, I'm praying for a miracle that like, you could do something and you could fix this without any sort of like human means. Like, yeah, he can, but the reality is he probably won't. But we do that in other areas of our lives too, is we think that we want God to show up, we want him to heal us, we want him to do something in our lives, heal relationships, heal friendships, fix our faith. There's something that we're going through. We want him to just bring about a miracle in our life so that all of a sudden we can be closer to him, but we don't want to do our part in God working in our lives. Because it's a lot easier to just sit there and say, God, I'm going to pray for this, I'm going to pray for this, instead of actually taking steps of faith to say, God, I'm walking into what you have for me. I'm going to walk into what you have for me, even when it doesn't make sense, even like when I don't know if it's something I want to do. Like for me, like surgery was not something that I really wanted to do, but I was like, God, I recognized, I was like, this is how my nose is going to get fixed. And the same way in our faith and our Christian walks, we've got different parts of our lives that God says, yeah, I could do a miracle in your life, but I want to teach you something in the process because I've put, whether it's my word or I've put people or I've put these things in your life that you can use and that you could walk through the process because you're going to be able to gain so much more from that. Your heart is going to be changed so much more from that than it would if I were to just show up and do a miracle in your life. So the passage that we're going to be looking at today is talking about that. It's the story of Elisha. So if you were at camp, we worked through the story of Elijah, and we saw God do just some really incredible things in his life. We saw, the story of the prophets of Baal, where they set out all these sacrifices to their gods, and their gods never showed up. And then Elijah set a sacrifice in the altar to God, and God showed up big time and showed off. And so there's that story, and the other stories that we worked through the week was basically God showing up over and over in Elijah's life. But this story of Elisha that we're going to be in, it's in 2 Kings chapter 3. So if you have your Bibles, you can open up there. But this is a story about God not showing up. And I think that this is such a fitting story for us to go through this week, because I'm just wondering if there's somebody out there who came back from camp a week ago and you made, maybe it was even a first-time decision to follow Jesus, and you've started to realize that being a Christian is hard. You started to realize that there's things in your life, whether it's old habits or old desires or old sin that was entangling you before camp, that you're still struggling with that now. That, there's things that you thought that God was going to show up in your life, and you're starting to see a week back from camp, that you're starting to trickle back into life's normal habits, and you're starting to see God like you don't feel like he's shown up. And I think for some of you, maybe even if you didn't go to camp, you know what I'm talking about. You know those times in your life where you just keep praying over and over, God, take this from me, take this sin, take this addiction, take this thing from me, because I don't want to deal with it anymore. And you pray over and over and over, but God doesn't seem to show up. That's the story that we're looking at today. And basically, what do we do when it feels like God isn't showing up? So we're going to be in 2 Kings chapter 3, starting in verse 9. It says this. It says, "So the king of Israel set out with the king of Judah and the king of Edom. After a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals with them. 'What,' exclaimed the king of Israel, 'has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to deliver us into the hands of Moab?'" It starts this way. It says, there's these 3 kings that in the Old Testament, these were 3 of the big armies of the time that they banded together. They're like, okay, God has called us to take this land that he's promised, this land that he's given us. He's calling us to go to war. And so these 3 kings got their armies together. They got all their strongest soldiers, and they're like, hey, we're going to go take this land. It should have been an easy battle for them, because their armies were really strong. By human standards, it should have been an easy battle for them to win, for them to show up, and for them to go take their enemies. But what happens is that they don't wind up winning. They're not only, when we get to this part of the story, not only have they not won, but all of a sudden it says, after a roundabout march of 7 days, the army had no more water for themselves or for the animals with them. So not only had they not won the battle, but now they're all dehydrated, and they're slowly dying of thirst. And they're wondering, okay, God, where are you? Like, we thought we were doing this for you. We thought that we were taking this land for you, but you haven't shown up. You see, this book of 2 Kings is in the Old Testament, but it's after some of the stories of God's people before then. There's this story of the walls of Jericho. It's in it's talking about Joshua, this guy who was the commander of God's army, the commander of God's people, and he marched around the walls of Jericho with his army for 7 days, and on the 7th day the wall fell down. And I think some of you, if you've been around church for a while, you've heard that preached, where it's like, hey, if you've been praying for something over and over, you never know when you're on like day 5, day 6, and you're just waiting for day 7 to come, and God's going to answer your prayer. And that's a really good, feel-good story, and yes, God does that sometimes, but this story, I wonder if some of them were looking back on history and they said, okay, God showed up then, but we're on day 7 and he hasn't shown up yet for us. That we're on day 7 and God is not only, he hasn't shown up, but we feel like we're worse off now than we were before. And you see, they get to this point where they cry out and they say, "What, has the Lord called us 3 kings together only to deliver us to the hands of Moab?" Basically, they're like, hey, God has abandoned us. And they don't know where he is in this situation. And you see, what they started to deal with was doubt. As they got to day 7, they got past day 5, day 6, onto day 7, and they said, we feel like God is drifting farther and farther away from us. We don't know where he is, and we're starting to doubt that he's there. And I think that that's the place where we go to too when we don't feel God in our lives, is we ultimately drift into this place of doubt where we say, okay, I don't know where God is. I don't know if I can trust him. I don't know if he's worth following. And that can happen even in the matter of a week coming back from camp, because sometimes life can knock you down so quickly that you start to doubt God's goodness in that. And that's a very real thing. That's not something that means you're a bad Christian. That doesn't mean you're a bad person. That just means that you haven't felt God's presence and you're saying, God, where are you? You start to doubt. And that's what these people did, is they started to doubt. They said, where is God? Did he only lead us this far, only to leave us? And we sing that song, Faithful to the End, where we say, there was never a day where you weren't by my side. There was never a day where you let me fall. These people are starting to doubt that truth because they don't know if they can actually trust God. So then they have a plan that they're like, okay, this is what we're going to do. We decided that we were going to march in with our armies this way, but we haven't seen God move. And so we're going to go try to find somebody who can maybe hear from God for us. So they go in verse 11. They say, has the Lord called us three kings together only to deliver us into the hands of Moab? It says, but Jehoshaphat asked, is there no prophet of the Lord here through whom we may inquire of the Lord? An officer of the king of Israel answered, Elisha, son of Shaphat, is here. He used to pour water on the hands of Elijah. Jehoshaphat said, the word of the Lord is with him. So the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat and the king of Edom went down to him. So basically what happens is these three kings are trying to do things kind of their own way. They're saying, hey, we're going to take this city. We're going to take this land. And it didn't work out the way that they had hoped it would. And so they'd exhausted all their options. Their armies had tried to take this land and it didn't work. And they're stuck out in this desert wasteland and they're slowly dying of thirst. And they're saying, okay, we're down to our last resort. You know who their last resort was God. They didn't go to God first and say, God, what's your plan for us? They didn't go to God first and say, Lord, how would you have us go about this? No, they tried everything else they could. And then they said, well, there must be somebody who has a word from the Lord. There must be somebody who can direct us to God's plan. And, I look at this and it's so easy for me to look at it and judge and say, why wouldn't you go to God first? Why wouldn't you try to do things God's way first and instead try to do things your own way? But then I look at my life and I look at the things that I've tried to do. And I look at over and over again the times where I've picked God's way over mine first and it's worked out so great. But all the times that I've picked my way over God's first because it's easier. Like that's what it is. I think you guys can all relate that it's easier to try to do things our own way than it is God's way. That when God calls us to do something in the Bible, when he calls us to love our enemies, when he calls us to not gossip about people, when he calls us to love all of those around us, to honor our parents, that those things are difficult and we would rather do things our own way than God's way because it's easy. And then only when life starts to get hard, when life starts to beat you down, then you say, okay, God, I'll do it your way. And that's exactly what happened here is they were beaten down to the point where they had nothing left. They had nothing left except for to turn to God. And so they said, okay, there must be somebody here, somebody who, even though we haven't had faith in God, there's got to be somebody who can direct us in the way that we could go, in the way that, God would have us go. So it continues on this way. It says, so the king of Israel and Jehoshaphat, the king of Edom, went down to him. This is I love this part of the text. Okay, so they go down and they see this guy named Elisha, and Elisha's a prophet, and so he's like this spiritual holy man. Like he knows, he gets the word from the Lord and like speaks it to the people. And so I don't know about you, but I've got this like stereotype of like the wise guru that's up on top of the hill, and he's got like his legs crossed and he's sitting there and he's like, well, what do you seek? And then you like tell him what you want, and he's like, well, first you need to close your eyes. You need to breathe real deep, and you got to find like your inner center. Like that's the idea that I have of like a holy person. But this guy is just, he's just a straight up savage with these people. He sees them and he sees them coming, and he's like, Elisha said to the king of Israel, why do you want to involve me? Go to the prophets of your father and the prophets of your mother. No, the king of Israel answered, because it was the Lord who called us three kings together to deliver us into the hands of Moab. Basically what he's saying, he's like, look, you didn't want anything to do with me before. Elisha's saying, you didn't want anything to do with God before, so why do you want something to do with God now? Why is it that every time your life gets hard, you turn to God, but when things are good, you don't want anything to do with them? That he's like, you're only coming to me because your army is in shambles. You're only coming to me because you're at your absolute low point. You're not coming to me because you actually want to hear from God. But it's because you have nothing left that you're here. And so he gives them a little bit of sass. He's like, why do you want to involve me? What are you doing? He's basically like, why don't you just go back to the prophets of your father and your mother? Why don't you go back to doing things the same way that you had before? And then the kings respond this way. The king of Israel says, no, because it was the Lord who called us three kings together to deliver us into the hands of Moab. That, even though it took him to get to his lowest point, he did recognize that, okay, I need to do things God's way. I need God to show up in my life because I am at that rock bottom place, because we are at that place where if God doesn't come through for us, we're in trouble, because we're in trouble already. But it's God, we recognize that we may be in trouble, but that God's greater than that trouble. And so if he can show up, then maybe, just maybe, we have a chance. And so he shows up to Jehoshaphat, and he shows up to Elisha, and he says that. He's like, no. No, you don't understand. We're not going away. We're not going back to the way that we did things before. We're not going back to those prophets of our father and mother, because we recognize that you are a prophet of the Lord, and we don't want our ancestors. We want God. He's saying, that's the way we want to do things. And so for us, we look at that, and it's the same thing where we're like, okay, if we're persistent in saying, okay, God, I may be at this rock bottom place, but I want you to show up, that's when we're going to hear from the Lord. And so it goes on to say this, and you know how I said Elisha was a savage a second ago? This is where it gets even worse. So he says this. It says, Elisha says, as surely as the Lord Almighty lives, whom I serve, if I did not have respect for the presence of Jehoshaphat, king of Judah, I would not pay any attention to you. Like, this is straight up, this dude's like, I don't want anything to do with you. This would be like me standing up on this stage and saying, as surely as the Lord Almighty lives, if I did not have respect for Brian Howard, I wouldn't want anything to do with you. Like, basically, like, I'd be standing up here saying, I don't really want anything to do with you guys, because I know, like, what your lives would look like. I know the decisions that you made, and I don't want anything to do with you. Like, I'm not going to say that because I love you guys. Like, this is great. I love being here. I love Brian. I love this church. But this is exactly what this guy's saying here. He's like, if I didn't have respect for Jehoshaphat, I wouldn't want anything to do with you, because I've seen you trying to do things your own way. Because I've seen the way that you've been living your lives, and you say that you're living for God, but you're really not. But he says, because of that, because I have respect for him, I'm going to hear you out, and I'm going to tell you what God might have you do. I'm going to tell you what that plan for God, what that plan that God has for you is. And he says this. You might think it would be something super spiritual, but he says this in verse 15. He says, but now bring me a harpist. It's like, okay, dude, I thought you were going to tell us what to do. You said, hey, bring me a harpist. But, this was just really interesting to me. When I was looking at this text, I was like, what in the world? And I started to think about it. And he says, but bring me a harpist. And I was like, what, are you trying to set the mood? Like, what's the deal here? This is weird. But if you think about it, what he was doing was something, not only was something that many prophets of his time would do, is they would bring in a musician to play music when they were getting ready to prophesy, or they were getting ready to speak over somebody. That was something that was pretty normal back then. But I don't think it's that different from what goes on right now. Like, I know we joke about this before preaching, is there's this thing called the prayer pad, where it's basically like when I get toward the end of my message, or Brian gets toward the end of his message, somebody comes up and starts playing keys behind us, and all of a sudden everything that we say sounds like hyper spiritual. Like, it sounds, yeah, you know what I'm talking about. There's nothing different about it. Like, I could say the same thing right now, and I can say the same thing 15 minutes from now when somebody's playing keys, and it's going to sound like that much more spiritual then. And that's something that, like, it may sound weird, or it may sound manipulative, but it's really not, because what it is it's just preparing your heart to hear from God. It's the same thing where when we pray, we go into a quiet space to say, God, I want to hear from you. I want to remove all the distractions, because I just want to hear from you. That this is what he was doing. He was saying, there's these things that there could be all these distractions, but I just want to hear from God. And so that's what he says, like, bring me a harpist. That's what he's doing. He's not setting the mood like we would think. He's saying, hey, bring me an opportunity for me to posture my heart toward God, so these people can posture their hearts toward God. He says, bring me a harpist. Then it happened, when the musician played, that the hand of the Lord came upon him. And he said, thus says the Lord, make this valley full of ditches. Now, think back to the beginning of the story. There was no water. That was exactly the problem, that there was no water. So basically what he's saying is, your translation may say pools, but it would be like empty pools or empty ditches. The whole point of a ditch or a pool is to hold water. And so if you're sitting there and you're one of these three kings, you're like, well, I don't want you to tell me to go dig ditches because there's no water. That's why we're here. Like, we're here because you're telling me that there's no water in our land, because, like, our people are dying of thirst, and you're telling us to go dig ditches for the water that's not there. Like, I'd be pretty peeved. Like, I would not be happy if somebody told me that. They're like, okay, so you're dehydrated, you're tired, You've been marching around for a while. So this is what I want you to do. Is I want you to go exert more energy, take a shovel, and go dig ditches. I'd be like, am I digging ditches or am I digging graves? Because like, this is not going the way that I hoped, and pretty soon we're all gonna be dead. Like, that's what would be going through my mind. But what he's saying is that this is what God wanted them to do, and this was an act of trust, saying, hey, even though the water isn't there yet, are you gonna dig? Because it will be there. He says, even though the water's not there yet, are you gonna be willing to dig? Are you gonna be willing to do what God has told you to do, even though it hasn't come to pass yet? That's what Elijah was telling them, was saying, even though God hasn't come through yet, this is what he wants you to do to be prepared for the day when he does. And for us, there's so many times in our lives where we would much rather have God just bring the miracle. We would rather have God bring the rain than we would have him tell us to dig ditches to be prepared for the rain. But when you think about it this way, if they hadn't dug the ditches, then when God brought the rain, it would all just washed away because they wouldn't have been prepared for God's provision in their lives. But the fact that they decided to dig the ditches, that they decided to go and do the hard work of digging, meant that they'd be prepared for when God decided to bring the water. When God brought the water to them, that they could actually hold on to it, that they could actually drink it, that it would actually do them some good instead of just washing away. So that's what Elisha told them. He says, make this valley full of ditches, for this is what the Lord says. You will see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water, and you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink. This is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. He will also deliver Moab into your hands. You see, he says this. He says the water is going to come. He says the miracle is going to come. He's saying God is going to show up. But you got to be ready for it. You got to dig those ditches. You got to prepare your heart. You got to prepare your mind. You got to prepare your life so that when God shows up and he does the miracle, you're ready for it. He's saying, you got to be unafraid to step out in faith even when it doesn't make sense, to do the things that God's calling you to do right now to prepare for the future that God has for you later. That's exactly what he's saying here. And these people are at their worst. They're at their lowest point. And he's saying, hey, you got to just keep digging. You got to go back. You got to dig ditches because God's going to show up. And God doesn't want you to miss out on what he has for you. But you got to be faithful right now so that you can see that later. And so for each one of us, I look at this story and I look at the first part of this text where it says, for this is what the Lord says. You'll see neither wind nor rain, yet this valley will be filled with water. And you, your cattle, and your other animals will drink. And I think so many times we get caught up praying for that miracle of rain that we miss out on, one, not only digging the ditches, but two, we're so focused on God showing up. We're so focused on what God might do that we miss the process of what God wants to do in our hearts. Because you see what happens here is he says, for this is what the Lord says, you will see neither wind nor rain. You think about it. I read through this the first time. I was like, okay, great. They dug ditches, they kept digging, and then God brought rain. But you see, they didn't even see the rain. They didn't see wind or rain. They didn't see the storm. They didn't actually see the miracle of what God did in their life. But they saw the result of it. They saw the water. And that's the important part, is that they were willing to dig those ditches. They were willing to say, God, I know that you have called me to do this, and so I'm going to do it so that even if I miss out seeing what you're going to do, I'm going to see the result of it. Even if I feel like my family is so broken that it's beyond repair and there's nothing that I can do about it, I'm going to continue to honor my mother and father. I'm going to continue to love those people. Even when they hurt me, I'm going to continue to try to show love so that even if, it's not in a split second when you heal my family, someday I'm going to look back and say, wow, God showed up. That if it's in your friend group and maybe you feel like you've just been ostracized from them, that you've cast yourself away, that there's something going on, that you can't fix those friends, that if you just turn to God and say, hey, God, I'm going to pray. I'm going to start loving people. I'm going to start making life not about me. I'm going to start making life about other people. I'm going to start trying to serve and trying to love. I'm going to dig those ditches in my life, in my own heart, so that then someday when you restore that friendship or when you bring new friends, I don't even need to focus on that because I'm so focused on the transforming work of you in my heart that I don't need to focus on the end result. You see, that's what happened here is they didn't see the rain. They didn't see the miracle, but they saw the result of it because their hearts were so changed. And so I look at this and that just encourages me there. And then it goes on to encourage me even more, where it says, this is an easy thing in the eyes of the Lord. You see, God didn't call the people to bring the rain down. God didn't call these kings to say, hey, go walk hundreds and hundreds of miles to bring the rain or to bring water in buckets back to your people. He didn't say that. No, he said, do what you can do. He said, go dig ditches. He's like, you got a shovel? You've got the means to go dig this ditch. Go do it. He says, you have the means to do this. You are able to do this, so go do it. He didn't tell them to bring the rain because he knew that they couldn't. He knew that only he could do that. He knew that only he could bring the rain. Only he could bring the water. And so he didn't ask the people to go do that. But what he did do is he asked them to say, he said, hey, do what you can do. So that when I show up and do what only I can do, you can look and reflect on it and say, wow, that was God. Because you see, when we dig ditches, when we prepare for what God might do in our lives, he shows up in a way that we can look at and we can't take any of the credit for it. That we can prepare our hearts, but ultimately God's the only one who can change our hearts. We can share the gospel with people. We can love people, but ultimately God's the only one who can save people. But you see, when we step out in faith and we say, I'm going to do my part, I'm going to do what I can do, I'm going to do what God has empowered me to do through his word, then God's going to show up and do what only he can do. And that's the amazing part here, that it says this was an easy thing for the Lord. That bringing the rain was easy for God. That healing those relationships was easy for God. That, if you're in a spot where you're bound by an addiction, the healing is an easy thing for God. It doesn't say that he will always heal, but it says it's an easy thing for him. And he's saying, just go dig those ditches in your life. Dig those ditches so that you're prepared for the healing that God is going to bring about, so that you're ready and you have a transformed heart, so that when God does what only he can do, you're ready for it. You see, it ends like this. It says, the next morning, about the time for offering the sacrifice, there it was, water flowing from the direction of Edom, and the land was filled with water. You see, this is ultimately the provision of God over this story. That ultimately God said, hey, I'm going to show up even though you've been marching around for 7 days, even though you're at your wit's end, even though you finally turned to me after you wanted nothing to do with me for a while and you were doing your own thing. He said, now that you turned to me and you decided that you were going to dig those ditches, you decided that you were going to posture your heart toward me, you decided that you were going to just keep digging even when it was hard, even when you were exhausted, that I'm going to show up. It says about the time for offering the sacrifice, there it was. The sacrifice was this thing that the people of this time would offer to God. They would offer something to God and say, God, this is yours. Sometimes it was called a burnt offering. Sometimes it was meat. Sometimes it was grain. It was these different things that these people had, but they were giving what they had to God. And if you can imagine just this picture of they were down to almost nothing left, and it was about time for the sacrifice where they were going to give up even more to God, where they were saying, God, what we have is yours because we trust you even though life's hard, even though we almost have nothing left, even though we're at our wit's end, we're going to trust you. They said, even though life's hard, we're going to trust you because it's time to offer the sacrifice. But it says just about that time, that's when the Lord came through. Because you see, when you're at a point in your life, when your heart is so postured toward God, where you're saying, God, even if I have nothing left, even though if I feel like I'm down to almost nothing, I'm going to give everything I have left to you. I'm going to offer that as a sacrifice. My life is a sacrifice to you because I know what you did for me. I know that you're good. I know that you're going to provide. When your heart is in that place, that's when God's going to show up. It may not always look the same way that you'd want it to look, but he's going to show up. It may not always be in the exact way or the exact time that you want him to show up, but he's going to show up. And just like he did in this story, where it says about the time for offering the sacrifice, there it was. I just wonder over each one of your life, if God is waiting for you to just dig those ditches so that same thing could be said over your life. But about the time for offering the sacrifice, there it was. There God was. There the healing was. There the fixing the broken relationship was. There it was. Because your heart is so postured toward God that he showed up and did only the things that he could do. So as I invite the band up to close, I just want you guys to be thinking about that this story is ultimately the story of God's provision for his people, not because his people were faithful, but because God was faithful. Because his people got to their wit's end and they said, God, we have nothing left. God, life hasn't worked out the way that we wanted it to. The plan that we thought you had for us didn't work out the way that we wanted it to. We're at a point where we can't look anywhere but to you. But we recognize that you're not our last resort, that you're our only option, and we're putting our faith in you. And so we're willing to dig those ditches, no matter how long it takes, because we know that you will come through. Because the beautiful thing about who our God is that just like in this story, he didn't tell them how many ditches they needed to dig. He doesn't tell us exactly what we need to do or exactly what'll be enough or exactly like what we can scrape by with. He says, no, I don't want part of you. I don't want you to just dig part of a ditch and then like I'll fill it with a little bit of water and you're good. No, he says dig ditches. He just tells them to keep digging. Even when it's hard, keep digging. Even when it's difficult, keep digging. Just like in your life. He's saying, hey, don't stop partway there. When you feel like you're giving people a little bit of love and you're trying to gossip a little less, you're trying to talk a little less bad about people and a little bit good about them, he says, keep digging. Keep loving people, keep serving people. You say, if that addiction didn't beat you today and you said, Satan, not today, I'm gonna keep walking toward Jesus. He's saying, keep going. Because I don't want you to just dig a ditch today. I want you to dig a ditch tomorrow. And I want you to dig a ditch the day after that so that then when I fill them with water, then you're gonna see me working in your life and you're gonna be able to praise nobody but me. Because you know that I'm the healer. You know that I'm the provider. You know that I am who I say I am. That I'm faithful, that I'm with you, that I'm for you. And so I just wonder for some of you today, that whether it's a relationship or a friendship, whether it's your family, whether it's something, some addiction, some struggle that you've been dealing with since camp, there's some sin that's been in your life that's been holding you down that you want to break free from. I wonder if today's the day that you stop just sitting there and saying, God, would you please take this from me? And today would be the day that you start digging ditches to say, God, I'm ready for you to show up in my life and I need you to bring this water, but I'm gonna do what I can so that you can do what only you can. And so as we close in prayer, I just ask that you guys would all lift that up to God, because we all have that. We all have those areas in our lives that we need to dig ditches in. And so I ask that we would just pray for the release of any fear that's holding us back from digging those ditches, anything that's holding us, keeping us from experiencing that would just go away. So Lord Jesus,